Hey everybody, it's Wintermute, and I'm here at Wintermute Gaming, and I want to talk about something that I haven't seen many videos on. Now I'm sure they're out there, and I'm sure some people have talked about it, but I don't know whether it's talked about for its own merit, and I think it's worth diving into because there's so many more people spreading out into the greater tabletop role-playing community, and they're seeing a lot of systems for the very first time. And it boils down to when picking a system and looking for a game system and what you want out of a system, there are kind of two broad categories in the way game systems are designed. And those are like the generic systems that can be picked up and put into any setting or any setting can be applied to them. And then there are the ones with the rule system specifically written for a setting in mind or a genre in mind. Now, the most clear example of the genre-based role-playing system is, well, D&D and Pathfinder. Those rule systems are written from the ground up to take into account that medieval, Tolkien-esque fantasy style setting. So all the rules work towards that, more or less. Now, there's some caveats there, which I'll get into. But then you've got other systems like GURPS, and we're going to use GURPS as the primary example. And there are other ones out there, like the I believe Rifts by Palladium is very similar. I've never played that one. Um, I know the Cipher system is designed to be that way. But the reason I picked GURPS is because it actually stands for Generic Universal Role Playing System. Oh, I'm sorry, Fate. Fate is another one that is worth mentioning in terms of being a setting agnostic kind of system. And those rule systems tend to be designed in a way that here's the system, and then you can take this system and apply it to any setting. It doesn't matter where the setting is. You will have to tweak it some to make it work within that specific setting. And I'll get into some examples of what that is. So, which one is better? Which one is right for you? Which one should you pick? Well, there are some considerations. And a lot of it's going to boil down to you and what you want and what your group wants and how you look at the rules. Okay. And I've had this discussion with a buddy of mine before, and I used to prefer generic universal role playing systems like GURPS in a sense that I put them on a higher tier than specific setting rule systems, more like D&D. And I think another system that would fall in that category is Call of Cthulhu and World of Darkness to an extent. The old school falls into that category as well. There, it went through a bit of a revision once they had their Apocalypse plotline, which was weird. I'm not gonna go into that here. Um, and they tweaked it in a way that I thought was really good. But it still was very setting specific the way the rules were designed. Even though you could now realistically you could take any rule system and set it anywhere you want. You could take the standard Pathfinder rules and you could put them in a modern setting, but the amount of reworking you're going to have to do is pretty dramatic, as opposed to GURPS, which is designed, and other universal systems, which are designed in a way to the tweaking is a lot more minimal. For example, with GURPS, you simply pick you it gives you a wide variety of skills that covers a wide variety of technologies and realities. Like hunting is something that would be much more important in a setting in the set in prehistoric times or medieval times, whereas there nobody in that setting would have a computer skill. That would be a more modern or futuristic setting. So it gives you a wide list of skills, and then you, as the storyteller, go, okay, well, for the setting, the game that I'm going to run, I'm going to take these dozen skills. My setting is in an X File style setting, so it's a modern setting. But in addition to that modern setting skill set, including computers and driving cars and and then standard stuff that's going to be in any setting like athletics and some sort of hand-to-hand combat and shooting skills, be it firearms or bows, medieval style weapons. There's going to be I'm going to make sure that there's also alien tech related skills that are also going to be in there because that's relevant to the setting. And that's the advantage of a universal role playing system in that you can tweak it and it can kind of go anywhere and do anything. And one example of this is I've heard George R. R. Martin, obviously the author of Game of Thrones and other works such as Wild Cards, talk about his role playing group actually tends to play in ancient Rome with no fantasy elements. It's literally ancient Rome. And so my understand, and I don't quote me on this, but my understanding was that he was using, and I forget, I believe he mentioned what system they were using, but it was one of those generic systems. And that works great for that. I can't think of any role playing system out there that was designed from the ground up to be set in ancient Rome. Again, as opposed to D&D, which was from the ground up designed to be a medieval fantasy setting. So for kind of non-typical settings like that, something like a GURPS or Fate would be great, and those should work just fine for what you're trying to do. And then you can just tweak it a little bit farther, and maybe not at first. Maybe you play a couple sessions, and after a while, the players give some feedback. Go, well, this is great, but we want to add more in-depth combat. We feel that the combat system is a little bit too watered down and generic, and we want something a little more intense because so many of our characters are Roman soldiers, or just for example, or whatever the case is. So okay, so you kind of retweak things using the universal role playing system, and you add, you can get a supplement or whatever, or maybe they have that in the core rule book where it explains here's a simplistic kind of combat for games that are not combat heavy, but here's more in depth combat for games that you know there's going to be a lot of fighting. So there's some flexibility there, but I think there's a lot more work that the GM and the storyteller has to do to be able to get things up and running and make it all working and moving forward. So that's the disadvantage and the advantage of those universal systems. They can kind of go anywhere and do anything, but at the same time, there's more work for the GM. Now, there is another disadvantage that I want to talk about, but I'll get into that in a minute. So, as opposed to D&D where you can sit down and it's all right there. Now you can still tweak D&D. I mean there's house rules galore out there. And you have players who go, "Well, I want a more horror-based game." And there are supplements and rules out there for at least house rules out there that talk about that and say, well, if you want a more horror-based game, it's more, and you want it to be more about more than just you're throwing horrific things at the players, but there's actually an element there in the rules that reinforces that. There are supplements out there that talk about how to do that. And that brings me to my other point, and this is the biggest thing I think that separates the two. And I actually had a discussion with a buddy of mine a while years and years ago, where, like I said, I put universal role playing systems on a higher tier. And he said, no, I disagree with you. And he said, the reason being that I disagree with you is the rules help make the game. And what he meant by that was the rules help the game feel a certain way. So if you tell somebody that you're going to play, this is going to be a very combat heavy game, but then the combat rules are very simplistic and there's no depth to them, you may not achieve that feeling. Same thing with the example of you want a D&D game with a horror with more horror. There's a lot of horror elements in this. So you can put it in all the trappings of that and you can do a very good job at role playing it and presenting it to the players as that. But at the same time, maybe it never quite feels that way because it's like, okay, but it's okay, instead of, fighting the fairy queen in the Feywilds, we're just fighting this powerful vampire, but it's still mechanically the same feeling. So if you want to have it feel more like a horror driven game, a horror setting, you might want to add in a sanity or a stability system, it's like Call of Cthulhu has. And there's an example of a great example, and that's probably the most striking example of how the rules make the system feel help immerse you in the world that you're playing. Because if you haven't played Call of Cthulhu, it's based off the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, who is, of course, the father of modern horror. So many elements of modern horror and fantasy as we know them, and science fiction. But so many of his stories centered around the personal experience of the horrific things that the characters in his stories had to deal with. Hell, half his stories were set in an insane asylum with a guy on his last, shred of sanity recounting what happened. Or they just go insane by the or they get lost in time and space. For I mean, it's truly dark stuff. Um, and if you like that, Call of Cthulhu is a great game for that. Okay, the mechanics surrounding the game, the sanity level that your character has, and the way that they can go insane, the chipping away at their mental stability as it's one horrific thing after another helps immerse you in that game. It makes that game feel like you're playing against this cosmic horror, which is what most of his stuff is about. It makes you feel that as you're playing the game. But if you were to introduce a Call of Cthulhu and you just tell your players, well, we're going to play a H.P. Lovecraft themed game and we're just going to use GURPS, but then you don't include any sort of sanity elements in that game or any rules to reinforce this, all right, this cosmic beast comes running at you, but there's no checks for becoming, terrified of this thing and just running away at the very least, at the sheer mind destroying craziness of what you're dealing with. If there's nothing like that, suddenly the game maybe just doesn't feel like you're really playing something based on the horror stories of H.P. Lovecraft. So it doesn't have that feel to it. So, which do I prefer? Well, it depends. I actually tend to lean towards systems that are more specifically written for what they're doing. Now, that doesn't mean that the other systems are bad by any stretch. And again, I go back to World of Darkness, old school World of Darkness. Old school World of Darkness, even before the revamp after their Apocalypse series, um, was still a very for all the different settings that you could play in with the World of Darkness. Now, all the different role-playing games within World of Darkness took place in the same world, and of course, the five flagships were Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse, Mage the Ascension, my favorite, Changeling the Dreaming, and Wraith the Oblivion. Those are the five flagship ones. Now, there were some others that they put out later for that, but they all basically had the exact same rule set, but they all played so differently. And just for example, I had a buddy of mine who pretty much primarily played Vampire the Masquerade. That's all he cared about. He really didn't have much interest in playing werewolf. And when he wanted werewolf antagonists to throw against his party of vampire players, he just and they were actually presented in the vampire book with just basically giving them vampire powers that were supposed to kind of fall in line with the stereotype of a werewolf and the way it would fight. He was very, it's just an antagonist of the week. And then I actually got him to play an actual Werewolf the Apocalypse game that I ran. And by the time we were done with that game, he's like, dude, I look at the Garou completely differently now. I'm excited to introduce them as enemies in when I go back to run Vampire. I'm excited to play them again in another Werewolf the Apocalypse game. To me, they were overly generic. But once I played the system with their rules about the way that the things that are important to them, because it's not just about the mechanics of combat and the special supernatural gifts that they have and the fact that they're werewolves. There's actual systems for a pack hierarchy and your renown and your glory and your wisdom within and the way that the rest of the community of the werewolves look at you based on your tribe and what moon you were born under and what role you play within the society. So that's intimately part of the game. And once he got away from that, here's just a generic werewolf using the vampire rules, and throw it at your enemies, and he's a big monstrous thing. Once you got out of that and you played the actual werewolf system, and you played with all those things that were super important to werewolves, it took on a whole new feel to it because everything around that reinforced what it was to be a Garou and the endless struggle against the worm. So that is, I think, one of the key examples I have in my experience, and that's probably one of the examples that kind of pushed me away from the generic systems are fine, but if you and your group doesn't take the time and effort to make them feel and make sure that you're playing with the right rules within that generic system to reinforce the feeling of that game, then I really think you are missing out on something. I really do. So when you look at the games out there, that is a way to look at them. And one more thing I'll add is, you may look at the World of Darkness and go, hey, everything you're saying makes sense, but I just don't like the rule system. The die pools and the way it works and successes and all that. I just don't like that. That doesn't feel right to me. I prefer the D20 system or something akin to the D20 system. Well, okay, that's great. At least it's good going into picking what game you want because there's no point in playing a game if you hate the rules. There's no point in playing a game like that. Even if you love the setting, and this is, and I would say this about there are board games I've played where I love the rules. The rules made sense; they were great, but the setting, the tapestry, the way it was painted, the theme of the game was just like it just kicked me out of the game. But you take those same rules and you put them in a different kind of setting, a different kind of environment. I think I'm going to love that board game. Well, so it can be with role playing games. So keep that in mind when you're looking at it. You may go and play World of Darkness and you go, hey, great setting, but I don't like the rules. I much prefer, we'll just say Cypher system now, which I'm not familiar with, but it's, like I said, it gets good reviews. I'd say I prefer the Cypher system. Well, now you know because you have played a proper World of Darkness game, and specifically, let's say Vampire the Masquerade or Werewolf or Mage. Now you can go back and you can go, well, I'm going to tool the Cypher system and I'm going to play a World of Darkness game within the Cypher system, assuming you can find players who want to do that. And I think that will be just perfect for me and my group and what we want. And so that's another way to look at them is you don't just because it's World of Darkness, you don't have to play by the World of Darkness rules. You can bring in a different system that you are more familiar with, and that's another facet of this. You get into World of Darkness and you're learning the rules. Now, World of Darkness rules are pretty simple, so it's one of the easiest ones out there. Now, I'm not up on the newest editions, but I don't think it's changed that much. But it's a very easy system to play and run for. So you can. So if you don't like the rules of that system, you can still swap it out with one of the more generic ones, retool it, make sure you've got all the facets that make that feeling of that world important within whatever rule system you use and move forward. And if you're familiar with it, you can hit the ground running. You don't have to look things up. You go, okay, I know how this works. I can just do it. And I can get on with telling the story. And for some groups, that's more important than the rules. Telling the story is more important than the rules, which is the last point I'm going to make. If you are more story driven and you don't, and some groups are like this, and it's all about the role play, and you make check, and you don't care what you're rolling for checks. Those are or maybe your group doesn't even have hard rules. They're there, but the DM adjudicates most of it. And I've done this. Player goes in and looks at something, and it's a piece of information I want to know that they have, or I want to. Okay, well, what's your skill in alchemy or whatever? Oh well, it's my total plus. I would have plus 10 to the roll. Okay, you know what? Don't even bother. Here's what you find, because you want them to have that information. And I'll be honest, I would recommend Trail of Cthulhu over Call of Cthulhu for that very reason. But that's another video. I love Trail of Cthulhu. Never had the chance to play it, but oh, I really want to so badly. So again, those are the pros and cons of a generic system versus a specific system for a setting. There are more that I probably did not think of or didn't. Maybe you thought I should go deeper into some of those points, or maybe you have an example of something that would kind of point out the differences, or maybe you feel that I'm wrong, and generic systems are superior in every way to those those setting specific rule systems. So if you watch this and you want to add some comments, feel free. I want to have a discussion about this specifically, but I also wanted to put this idea out there as new players are coming into the game. So for right now, this is Wintermute signing out from Wintermute Gaming.